at least no signs of illness since January the 14th of this year. So there's 9 months that have gone by with no evidence of any sickness. Now, if a person gets influenza and they get sick, after 2 weeks, we're considered them completely recovered and they are not infectious. So why the CFI thinks that this is IA thinks that this is actually birds that are asymptomatic, have no signs of illness, but could be actively shedding virus at this time. There's really no data at all to support this very unlikely assertion. And to make matters worse, the agency has prevented both the farmers from having them independently tested for the presence using either a PCR test or a rapid antigen test, or even allowing the test for antibodies in these birds or their eggs. Basically, if they did this with the call order, they're subjected to about a $200,000 fine and potential imprisonment. So really, we should be finding out whether or not these birds actually have immunity to explain the results that we've seen that these acquired from the wild, because this is where the ostriches got infected, that it would appear that these birds are not being infected with highly pathogenic influenza virus, but a low pathogenicity strain. And the claim has been made by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency that these birds have been infected with a reassortment. Again, as I described earlier, this mixing of gene segments from two different strains of the influenza virus. You have to understand that to get a reassortment event, this is extremely rare. You have to have basically two different strains of the virus in the environment infecting the same animal, and within that animal, the very same cells, in order to get a reassortment event. And so this is actually very, very rare. It's possible when you have a large number of animals and the number of these infections is very high, as you would have in a large population of birds in the wild that are very mobile. That has a greater chance of happening. But again, it's still considered a very rare event. Now, the chances that these birds were infected and then this reassortment happened in just a couple of the birds is astronomically low. So we believe the reassortment actually happened in the wild birds, and it was that infection from the wild birds that actually introduced the reassortment variant into the ostriches, which was of lower pathogenicity. And what the Canadian Food Inspection Agency has been, very quiet on, except when cross-examined during one of the court cases, we learned that, in fact, while this is considered a unique assortment from the standpoint of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, out of the 533 outbreaks that have happened in the last few years in Canada on these commercial farms, they have over 100 examples of reassortments. And they've been very quiet about this and not really published any data on this, but they did admit to it under cross-examination in court.
Wow, I thought this was going to be, I asked you for 10 minutes interview and you said this is going to take longer than that. And that's because there's a lot of moving parts to this. So
There is, yeah. Sorry about my phone. I'm just, it's kind of crazy.
didn't hear your phone. And again, thanks for doing this for people like me. So,
Yeah. Well, there's another thing I think it's really important for your viewers to understand. I mean, the claim is that these ostriches are actively shedding the virus, which again is when you have a animal or a person that is not showing any signs of sickness, that's a sign that the immune system of that individual, animal or person, has actually successfully eradicated the virus or reduced the levels of that virus in that individual to such low levels that the viral load is extremely low. And that means that the risk of transmission of that virus is also exceedingly low. And so it's highly unlikely that these birds are actually shedding the virus if they have an immune response. And to have so many of these ostriches that are the older ostriches not showing any signs of even illness, despite the fact that other members of that flock have died, right? I mean, you can have a scenario where you can have a a virus that can infect one species without killing it, but at low levels being able to be transmissible to another species. We see this with some bacteria. You know, the um, the the Black Death, you know, Yersinia pestis, that was responsible for wiping out maybe a third of the population in Europe back in the, I think it was the 1348, something around there. Well, the the rats didn't get sick. They were infected with the bacteria, and likewise the fleas that bit the rats that then went and bit people. The people were very susceptible to the Yersinia pestis, but the rats were not. And so you can have scenarios where you have vectors that can in fact harbor and even potentially propagate a pathogen, but those would normally, you would have, you wouldn't have any deaths in that species. Clearly, in the case of the ostriches, they're just as sensitive as likely chickens or ducks or geese to dying if they're infected with a highly pathogenic version, which is not what happened with this universal ostrich farm. So we've got data from the CFI that confirms that it's a reassortment with low pathogenicity virus. We have evidence that they actually have antibodies and have an immune response. The claims that the soil is contaminated with this virus shed from birds that have no symptoms is ridiculous, because the evidence that they're using to support this claim is they took water that was contaminated with the virus. Not they, but they're referring to a scientific paper where this was done. And they filtered that water with a 200 micron filter. Now, the size of the virus is 140 microns. So it goes through the filter. But most other viruses, bacteria, unicellular organisms like fungi, they can't go through that filter. So you have a highly filtered water, which is then kept in the dark in a metal container at near zero. And they were able to show that a year later, no longer than a year, but up a year later, they could still get active virus out of that. But in reality, when you have virus that's shed on the ground, it actually is inactivated by the sunlight with UV light, causes massive mutation of RNA. This is an RNA virus. It's very unstable. When you look at influenza itself, how is it's normally transmitted? It's in an aerosol, in tiny little droplets that are breathed in, and then the virus can replicate in the upper airways. This is not how influenza is transmitted, not in people or in animals. It's usually from being a suspension in the air. And so if this falls down to the ground, the sunlight destroys it, microbial action destroys it. And if this seems like, you know, to put it to make people feel more at ease, maybe not. You know, we have tens of thousands of these geese and ducks that are flying overhead during migration, you know, season, and they're landing on the parks and the schoolyards, and you know where I live in the dikes, and their excrement is all over the ground, right? Now we know that these birds have been an active transmitters of the virus to these commercial farms for the last few years. There's been only one case of H5N1 influenza in Canada in the last few years. And that was a 13-year-old girl who had health issues. Fortunately, she recovered. But that's the only case of H5N1 in people. And we haven't seen this in our pets and dogs, that are people are walking them through these parks, again, amongst all this excrement. If this virus was able to survive in the soil, as has been suggested by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, then why are we not getting special warnings from Health Canada and from the inspection agency with respect to the risks of these wild birds that are flying
Just
overhead
everywhere.
all
We
the time?
walk through parks. I live in Kelowna. We walk through city parks. Geese are everywhere.
Exactly.
They'd be blocking us out of the parks.
Yeah, and the reality is that the risk to humans is extremely low. I mean, even the Canadian Food Inspection Agency itself admits that if you eat food from, that's from contaminated with the virus, the risk in food is essentially non-existent. And if you look at all of the United States, they've only had a little over 70 cases, only one death. Now, that didn't stop the Canadian Food Inspection Agency in not, putting into context. The claim made by them is that half the people that have been infected, worldwide over the last, 40 years plus have died from H5N1. And the fact of the matter is, about 89% of those deaths in the last 15 years have actually been in primarily Asian countries, Vietnam, Cambodia, China, Indonesia, and also in Egypt. And in North America, we don't even know how many people actually have H5N1, but but of the confirmed cases, only one of them actually died. Again, it was an elderly man with comorbidities who kept chickens in his backyard, actually not in a commercial operation. So the risk to people is extremely low. And again, this idea of creating a pandemic, there's no case that's been documented of H5N1 being transmitted from one person to another person. So the concept that we're going to have a massive pandemic from some special mutated form of the virus from these ostriches is completely ridiculous. There's other things that we need to be more concerned about, and this is not one of them. And one thing that the sequencing information revealed is there are some mutations that occur in this virus that make it a little bit easier to infect mammals. But those mutations were not present in the sequence genome of this virus from the ostriches. So, and then I learned recently that the claim has been made by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency that, well, this actually turns out to have one of the most deadliest H5N1 variants from these ostriches. But when I look at the court record of what was provided by Dr. Kathy Furness, who's one of the experts for the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, that information was secondhand, word by mouth, apparently from something that was told to her by the Canada microbiology laboratory in Winnipeg, an individual there. We have seen no data, nothing published. We don't even know how they could even do this experiment, because in order to do an experiment like that, you have to recreate the virus. And when they got those soil samples, so those samples from those two dead birds, and that's the only time they've sourced at all material from these birds, that would have been for PCR. And it was probably fragments. So even though they got a full genome sequence, they still have to make the virus. And there's been no data to show that they've actually recreated the virus itself that infected these ostriches. So any suggestion that this is the most infected, most dangerous virus that they've encountered of the H5N1 by the Canadian Food Inspection is completely hearsay, not
So,
backed up by any data.
so doctor, I promised myself I have a big mouth, and I promised myself I was going to do no talking here. I was just going to listen to you. But when you just tell everybody here what Dr. Kathy Furness relayed, and this started about 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, we
That's
started
right.
to see on the news the shedding. Out of the blue, all of a sudden the shedding started hitting the news. People like me and everybody else, oh, what's shedding? And we saw somebody from the CFIA saying there's shedding. You're telling everybody here now there's no documented written reports that anybody has seen. It's basically hearsay. It's rumors, just like we're all doing when we're in discussion
Right.
room.
There's no data to support this. And the data that would be possible, even by the agency itself doing testing of the birds and the soil, they've not done it. If they had positive data, I'm sure they would have let us know. And in the court documents that we received, because I was one of the expert witnesses, so I've gone through all of the material that they've submitted. And this idea of a more pathogenic version, this was just actually submitted very, very recently, and I was not able to respond to it. I suspect that as this is going forward to the Supreme Court, you know, uh, basically it's been filed from the lawyer uh, Umar Sheikh for the ostrich farm, and now the Canadian Food Inspection Agency has the opportunity to respond, and then we can respond to their response, and then the Supreme Court will decide whether or not they want to hear the case. But now I have time to respond to to what it was that they originally had filed with the appeals of the federal court, Canada. So I now know that this idea that this is the most deadly strain that's been identified by the Winnipeg lab, like this is all hearsay. There's no data, and I'm not even sure that when I read the statement that was quoted, that that's what was meant by the person who even said this originally to Kathy Furness, that she basically referred to. I mean, when you have a expert testimony, you have to source your data and you have to be able to see that the statements you're making are in that data, whether it's a scientific report or anything like that. And that's not what happened here. So it's actually it's actually reprehensible that they went out on national media to make these statements that in fact is not really backed up by any documentation that they've provided.
Wow. Okay. Like I said, we're all in our little groups. Don't start rumors. Don't
Mhm.
don't say things that aren't backed up. And we've got the CFIA doing it.
Yes.
So now that the farm is they've got to stay in, and you talked about the Supreme Court and evidence.
Mm.
Just circle back to everybody again. And 6 weeks ago at the appeals court, and back in March, I think I read the evidence that you talked about earlier, where they had the massive antibodies in the yolks back in August 2024.
Right.
At the appeals court 6 weeks ago, they didn't consider that evidence.
No.
Tried to
No,
present.
what happened was the judges in these cases, because we had the original federal court and then the appeals for the federal court. And in both judgments that were made, they basically took what we call judicial notice. They didn't proclaim it as such, but that's essentially what happened. They stated that they went with the information that was provided by the scientific experts of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and they did not consider any of the expert um, reports that came from my report and other reports that was submitted by the lawyers for the Universal Ostrich Farms. So they did not look at it. And unfortunately, the in the arguments for, judging, well, what's the risk to society versus what's the damage that could be done to the farm, and they're weighing, which is as they should be doing, where is there the greater hazard or benefit? And as it turns out, they did not even consider the arguments that were put forward by the Universal Ostrich Farm with respect to certainly the science. And actually, there's even questions on the legal obligations, because people don't understand the World Organization for Animal Health provides guidelines. These are not laws. And in the guidelines, it's up to the individual countries to decide whether or not they're going to adopt those. Now, there are trade implications, and what happens is we try to go with the guidelines that's, with agreements with these other countries. And so the World Organization for Animal Health, when you have highly pathogenic influenza virus, not low pathogenicity virus, H5N1, the recommendation is that the zone would not be declared disease-free where this outbreak has occurred until either you do the culling process, where you kill any animal that's in contact with the diseased animals, and you wait 1 month, and if there's no other evidence, then you can go forward and now have trade, basically with the official stamp that this is disease free. Now that used to be 3 months prior to 2025. So it's interesting that they actually shortened the period after the stamping out policy. But the idea is that within 2 weeks, we don't expect that any further emergence is unlikely. So if you're disease free for a month, that's okay. Now, if you don't do that, and this is clearly an option provided through the World Organization for Animal Health, and you let it burn out, that means you let the herd or flock die, and any survivors, if it's disease free for a 1 year period, then you're back to the disease free zone status. Now, as it turns out, here in British Columbia, we have many different zones, and the bulk of the poultry industry is actually here in southern western British Columbia. And where the ostriches are on the Universal Ostrich Farm, it's in its own zone. So what goes on in that zone does not really affect the trade of poultry products in the other zones. The only situation I'm aware of where there could be an issue is where you have some agreements between countries that are respect to provinces. So in the case of British Columbia, it could affect our trading for poultry products with Mexico and with Russia. And that's about, the major potential. Now, during this entire time, you have to understand that we've had 533 outbreaks in the last few years. We've never had a disease-free status as a country, and for some of the provinces, not until just really quite recently, right? Because we haven't had an outbreak in Canada of H5N1 on a farm since actually January of 15th of this year. So we are coming into another season where we'll have migration of the birds, and it's possible that we'll see this. But the reality is, during the last few years, trade has not been reduced with the H5N1 pandemic, certainly for Canadian poultry products. It's actually increased during this period. So I don't buy the argument that our trade is being adversely affected by this, by
Well,
the H5N1.
that's the other thing. We read in the media about trade, and you just said that's not true
No, it's not true.
in the zone. So, two things I just took out of what you just said. You talked about the culling period.
Mhm.
Once the animals are, and I'm going to use the word slaughtered because culling means killing weak animals. In this
That's
case,
right.
killing healthy animals. But within a month of that, the area is deemed to be disease free. But it used to be
Right.
3 months. So that tells me, doctor, that our science is evolving.
Right.
Say that's the first thing. And then second thing, you'd mentioned that once the disease is deemed to have been burned out from the time the initial tests, so 365 days, these animals would be declared safe.
That's right.
Yet the CFAA wants to slaughter them before the 355 days is up, and we're close. We're close.
Right. I mean, the thing to bear in mind is that these animals are actually not being used to produce products for consumption. So that's one thing. The other is these birds are not very mobile. I mean, they can't fly. So they're fairly contained in where they are, and they're very visible birds. So if anything, if any one of them escaped, it'd be very easy to identify it and capture it. Uh, in fact, that's one of the things I find quite interesting is at this time, the the Canadian Food Inspection Agency is responsible for the care of these birds and feeding these birds. This very agency that wants to kill them. So, I mean, there's a little conflict with that. But nonetheless, I'm actually concerned for the health and safety of the people, the from the agency that are actually on site now taking care of these ostriches. Because these ostriches, they can be 9 feet tall, up to 350 pounds, and they have these two-toed claws that are like a velociraptor. And they, even lions in the wild, will not go and disturb ostriches because they respect that they could be badly injured. So the idea that people will be walking around in hazmat suits amongst these ostriches and they're not seeing their owners, so they're going to be very highly agitated. I think that those workers are actually at very high risk of being harmed themselves by these, 399 ostriches, on an open field. So I'm having a little bit of a hard time wrapping my mind around, like, for the safety of the people that are actually there. If you have new ostriches on a farm, it takes years before those ostriches feel comfortable enough that those care care people that provide them with care can walk around amongst those ostriches without causing any fuss. So again, this is extremely strange and doesn't seem to be very well thought through. I would have had the owners of the farm continue to care and feed for those animals until they would actually be called if it came to that.
Well, and that's the funny part too. Those of us who are on the farm, we watched the two CFIA reps right at the chain link fence, nose to nose with the birds in their street clothes. Yet a day
Mm,
later, they're jumping inside with their claws, putting on a white fabric.
yes.
Didn't make a lot of sense. Um, some of us at the farm aren't trusting the CFIA to be around those birds either for the safety of the birds as well. Um, I don't know if you want to comment on whether or not we trust
Well,
the
I mean,
CFIA as
I'm,
citizens.
I mean, again, the there's a conflict of interest here when you have an agency that's insistent on trying to kill these birds as soon as possible, being responsible for their caretaking. And as you point out, I mean, there's been people going back and forth on this site um, from police and CFIA not wearing protective equipment. And sometimes when they do wear the protective equipment, hazmat suits, then they leave the site with the hazmat suit and go on into restaurants and things like that, still wearing their suits. I mean, if this was so contagious, and influenza is not contagious off of fomites, like surfaces. I mean, I don't. You kind of wonder. Well, did these people know what they're actually doing, and are they organized that they're taking the correct precautions that should be taken, and are they like overdoing it where there isn't as actually risk? It's in some respects it's because if it wasn't so sad, this is so farcical. I cannot believe it. Yes.
Doctor, I just, as a citizen of this country, I can't tell you again how thankful I am that I picked up the phone and got a hold of you. I didn't think there was any way in hell I was going to hear back from you. So thank you. Thank you.
Yeah,
Um,
no, I think it's really important for people to understand what's going on, appreciate, where there's risk and where there's not risk. We don't want to be panicking over things that we don't need to panic about. There's plenty of things that we need to be worried about. But I think these these ostriches, they are a unique resource. They potentially could actually help us in understanding more about infection with H5N1 virus, how to detect it, how to prevent it, because the antibodies from these ostriches that are found in their eggs can be very valuable both as diagnostic or therapeutic tools. And so this is recognized, for example, by the National Institutes of Health, which have, repeatedly asked the government of Canada not to call these birds. But this seems to be falling on deaf ears within our own government.
not that this is relevant. I'm not a Donald Trump fan by any way, shape, or form. And maybe that clouded my judgment back in January when it started to be announced that the United States was pulling out of the World Health Organization. I
Mhm.
didn't pay a lot of attention to it then. Probably thought bad idea because I didn't like Trump. What I'm seeing occur in our country with the CFIA under the World Health Organization guidelines, um, I've changed my tune on whether. So the United States is pulling out of the World Health Organization. How do you
Mhm.
feel? Should Canada, in your opinion as an expert, is that something we should be considering doing?
It might be, and I'll tell you the reason why, independently of all of this ostrich situation or how they handled COVID. Um, we had the monkeypox situation, and they call it mpox because for some reason, I guess they don't want to. Um, the name was problematic for. I mean, the reality is that mpox was actually it was a pandemic, but a very limited pandemic. We had primarily people that were uh, homosexual males that were very, um, had multiple partners is where this disease showed up. And it generally is not a lethal disease. It's just not a very, it's an unsightly disease and it does clear up. And there are medications for it. Now, the thing is, the World Organization for Animal Health, under its director general, basically, that director general had an advisory panel of scientists that he queried to say, well, should we declare this as a pandemic? And the director general, he's not a scientist, he's not a medical doctor, okay? And the panel, his own advisory panel told him this is not a pandemic. And he went and overruled his own panel because he could, as the director general, and it was declared as a pandemic. And of course, when you declare an outbreak like that as a pandemic, then certain, laws and other actions can be taken that would not be possible unless it's officially declared as a pandemic. So to me, this was a clear abuse by the person at the head who was not really elected position to control the World Organization for Animal Health. And of course, who does he answer to? Well, the major benefactor of the World Organization for Animal Health is the Gates Foundation and the Chinese government And they were getting a fair amount of money from the United States as well. And now that money from the US is not coming. So I think the World Organization for Animal Health will be even more beholden to these other outside influences. And I don't think that's a healthy situation. So that's why I think maybe Canada, we need to reassess this.
Doctor, thank you very much, sir. I again
Yeah,
can't thank you
my
enough.
pleasure, Blake.
Just gonna try to how to stop recording here. Pause, stop recording.